She was hanging from a pine branch when Gideon stepped out of the trees. Her wrists were tied high above her head. Her dress was torn open down the front. Blood had soaked through the thin summer fabric and dried in dark patches. The sun was sinking behind the Bitterroot Peaks in the summer of 1885, and the last light made the whole scene look like something born from hell. She heard his boots before she saw him. Heavy, slow, certain. When he came close, she saw the scars across his bare chest and the knife at his belt. She began to shake. He stepped in behind her and pressed his body against hers, one arm sliding around her waist to hold her up. She gasped, breath ragged. When his hand moved to the handle of the knife, she broke. "Don't make me do that," she whispered. She thought she knew what came next. Gideon didn't answer. He looked at her shoulder instead. It hung wrong, out of place, swollen and twisted. He tightened his grip. Then he moved. The crack of bone snapping back into its socket split the quiet forest. Her scream tore through the trees. A flock of crows burst upward into the red sky. She went limp against him, tears spilling down her cheeks. He held her steady until her breathing slowed. Only then did he lift the blade and cut the rope. She collapsed into his arms, shaking, not yet understanding that the worst thing he had done was to save her from losing that arm forever. She wasn't a punishment. She was bait. A rifle bolt clicked softly somewhere above them. Gideon heard it. He didn't look up. He already knew. Gideon eased her down onto her feet. She tried to pull away from him, fear still in her eyes. "You're safe," he said quietly. She didn't believe him. Not yet. He crouched and picked up a strand of rope from the ground. He studied the knot. Tight, clean, professional. Not the kind of knot a ranch hand tied. Not the sloppy work of a drunk. This was a mercenary's knot. He had seen it before, years ago, in places where men were paid to hurt other men. He rose slowly. The forest was too quiet. No wind. No birds. No insects. Waiting silence. He counted the signs. Boot tracks in the dirt. Deep heel marks. At least 5 men. Heavy rifles. Military stride. They had not tried to hide their prints. They wanted him to see them. Another faint click came from the ridge above. Then another. 5 rifles. Open grass. No cover. Too far to run. This story comes from frontier accounts and old records, retold with added detail to bring out the lesson and the weight of those choices. Some moments have been shaped for clarity and meaning, and the images used to tell it are created with the help of AI to deepen the feeling of that harsh time. If this kind of story is not for you, rest easy tonight and take care of your health. But if your heart is already beating a little harder, stay with me and leave a comment so I know to keep bringing you stories like this. Martha clutched the small brass token hanging at her throat. He saw it and froze. He knew that token. It had belonged to Elias Turner. Elias had once shared a winter trench with him and split his last crust of bread in half. "Where did you get that?" Gideon asked. "It was my husband's," she said, voice trembling. "My husband is dead." The words felt wrong in the air. Gideon's fingers closed around the rope until the fibers bit into his palm. Accidents happened in logging camps, but men like Frank didn't leave things to accidents. Martha looked toward the ridge. "They said you would come," she whispered. He didn't ask who they were. He already knew. Frank had business in the valley, and dirty shipments and cheap land deals, men disappearing when they asked too many questions. Gideon had interfered before. Stopped a beating, burned a crate meant for something worse than whiskey. Frank hadn't forgotten. "They never left," Gideon said quietly. Martha's fingers dug into his arm. "They hung me here this morning," she said. "They said if you cared about old friends, you would come." The truth settled between them like cold iron. Bait. Gideon looked up at the ridge at last. The sun was low. The shooters had the light at their backs. He calculated distance. 300 yards. Good elevation. Clear line of sight. He had 1 rifle, 1 wounded widow, 5 rifles waiting. No second chance. He could step back into the trees alone. He knew paths no one else did. He could vanish before the first shot cracked the air. She would not make it 20 steps. Her shoulder was weak. Her legs were shaking. Her trust was shattered. He saw again the smoke of another summer long ago. A cabin burning, a wife screaming, A child he could not reach in time, men laughing in the dark. He had walked away from nothing that day. He had simply been too late. He would not be late again. He picked up his rifle at last, not in panic, not in anger. Calm, measured. He placed himself between Martha and the ridge. "If I tell you to run," he said softly, "you run toward the rocks behind us. Don't look back." Her eyes searched his face. She still feared him, but she nodded. Up above, a voice carried faintly on the still air. "Ghost," it called. Frank's voice, smooth, mocking. "You always did care too much." Gideon didn't answer. He adjusted his stance. 5 rifles. 1 wounded widow. Open ground. The sun almost gone. Frank thought he had set the perfect trap. But traps worked both ways in the mountains, and Gideon had just decided he was not walking away. Tell me this. When a man has already lost everything once, and the past stands there bleeding in front of him, does he protect himself, or does he step forward and dare the storm to try again? He felt the wind on his cheek, sighted a hair high, and accounted for the drop. Gideon didn't wait for the first shot. He fired first. The rifle kicked against his shoulder, steady and familiar, and a man on the ridge jerked backward out of sight. The echo rolled through the bitterroot trees like distant thunder. Then the world exploded. Gunfire cracked from above. Dirt kicked up at Gideon's boots. A bullet tore through the pine trunk beside Martha's head and showered her with bark. "Move," he said. Not loud, not panicked. She ran. Not graceful, not strong, but she ran. Her shoulder burned, her legs wobbled, yet she pushed toward the rocks behind them just like he told her. Another shot rang out. Too close. Gideon stepped sideways, fired again. Second man dropped to a knee. Did not rise. 5 rifles became 4. 4 rifles still meant death in open grass. He moved backward, slow and angled, never turning his back. He knew this slope, knew where the ground dipped, knew where loose shale waited to betray a careless boot. The shooters above did not. A third rifle barked. The bullet whined past his ear. He tasted metal in his mouth. Not fear. Focus. Martha stumbled behind a boulder and fell hard to one knee. She cried out, but didn't stop. Good, he thought. She still had fight. Down. He called. She flattened herself against stone. Another volley. He dropped low and rolled behind a fallen log just as a round split the wood where his chest had been. 3 rifles now firing in rhythm. Someone shouted orders from above. Frank's voice carried clear in the evening air. Drive him down. Flush him out. Gideon almost smiled. Frank always liked to talk too much. Talking got men killed. He fired again, quick and clean. A hat flew off ahead up on the ridge. The man behind it disappeared. 3 rifles, maybe 2, hard to tell. Smoke drifted through the trees. The sun dipped lower, light shifting. That helped him. He slid down the slope, using brush and shadow, keeping himself between the ridge and Martha. She crawled from rock to rock, breathing hard. When he reached her, he grabbed her arm. "Can you run?" he asked. She nodded, lied, but nodded. They moved together now, not straight down, sideways. Toward thicker timber, a shot cracked and Martha cried out. He spun. No blood. The bullet had struck stone inches from her face. Her eyes were wide. "Wow, they're everywhere!" She gasped. "No," he said, "just men. Men bled, men panicked. Men made mistakes." He led her into denser brush. Branches tore at her dress. He didn't slow. Behind them, boots crashed through undergrowth. They were coming off the ridge now. Good. That was what he wanted. Up high, they had the advantage. Down here, the mountain belonged to him. He reached a narrow cut between 2 boulders. Through there, he told her. She squeezed through, barely clearing the rock. He followed and kicked loose a stack of stones he had wedged there months ago. They tumbled down behind them, blocking the narrow pass. Shouts erupted on the other side. Delay bought seconds. Seconds kept people alive. They ran again. Martha's breathing grew ragged. Her injured shoulder sagged. He could see pain in every step. "Why are they doing this?" she asked between breaths. "Because you know something," he said. She hesitated. Then, as they ducked beneath a low branch, she spoke fast and low. "Frank poisoned my husband." She said, The words hit harder than gunfire. He said it was fever. She went on, but I saw him switch the bottle. I kept the proof. Gideon didn't stop moving. What proof? A map, she said. A hidden claim. A silver vein tucked into the hills. Not a boom, not a whole town of miners, just one quiet vein that could buy a man like Frank half the county. And that meant Frank wouldn't just hunt them. He'd erase them. There it was. Greed. Always greed. The map was the reason. The deed was the weapon. Frank didn't want her dead. Not yet. He wanted what she knew. A shot cracked again. Too close. A man burst through brush 20 yards behind them. Deputy's badge flashing on his vest. So that was how deep it went. The law hunting them too. Gideon turned and fired without breaking stride. The deputy staggered and fell into the grass. Martha saw the badge and froze. The sheriff's office. She whispered. Not all of it, Gideon said. Just one rotten branch. They reached a steep ravine. No easy way down. Behind them, more shouting. They were closing. Gideon looked at the drop, looked at Martha. No time for careful plans. He grabbed her around the waist. She tensed at first. Then she let him. He slid down the ravine, half falling, half running, boots carving dirt. One arm locked around her as rocks and dust poured down around them. They hit bottom hard. He shielded her with his body as loose stones clattered past. Above, figures appeared at the edge, rifles pointed down. Bad angle for them now. He dragged her under an overhang of rock just as bullets sparked against stone, breathing hard, chest rising and falling. She looked at him different now. Less fear. More understanding. You could have left me, she said quietly. Could have, he replied. He listened. Boots pacing above, men arguing. They didn't like the drop. They would circle around. That would take time. Gideon glanced at the narrow animal trail leading deeper into the forest. If they kept moving, they might shake them. But it would not end here. Frank would not stop. Not with silver in his head and pride on the line. Gideon looked at Martha again. You still got that map, he asked. She nodded, hidden inside her bodice. Smart girl. He gave a short breath that might have been a laugh. Well, he said, now we're both worth killing. Up above, a voice shouted. They're heading north? Wrong. Gideon had already turned south, into thicker timber, into ground he knew like the lines on his own scarred hands. He leaned close to Martha. Stay on my heels, he said. Don't think, just move. They disappeared into shadow. Behind them, men spread out across the slope, hunting ahead of them. The mountain waited. If you're still here, and your heart's beating like mine is, go ahead and subscribe so you don't miss what comes next. Pour yourself a cup of coffee or tea, settle in, and tell me what time it is, where you are, and where you're listening from. I'd like to know who's riding this trail with us tonight, because up ahead, this chase is about to turn personal in a way Frank never saw coming. They didn't stop running until the forest swallowed them whole. Night came fast in the Bitterroot. Gideon slowed only when he was sure no bootsteps followed close behind. He listened long and hard. No snapping twigs, just wind moving through pine needles. He nodded once. For now, he said. Martha leaned against a tree and slid down until she was sitting in the dirt. Her chest rose and fell hard. Her shoulder had begun to swell again. Pain does not care about courage. It comes anyway. Gideon stepped in front of her and crouched. We're close, he said. To what, my place? She stiffened at that. He saw it. She didn't trust cabins, did not trust doors, did not trust men who said you're safe. He stood and offered a hand. She hesitated only a second before taking it. They walked another mile through thicker timber. The ground grew steeper, rockier. This was not ranch land. This was mountain land, the kind that chose its own owners. When the cabin came into view, it didn't look like much. Rough logs, low roof, smoke hole patched with tin, no lantern light in the window. No sign of life. Is anyone else here? She asked. No. He opened the door and stepped inside first. Small space, table, iron stove, one narrow bed, a rifle rack. That was all. He set his rifle down and began moving without speaking. Water bucket, firewood, kettle on the stove. The simple rhythm of survival. Martha stood near the door like a cornered animal. You can sit, he said gently. She did not. He took off his shirt and tossed it onto the table. Old scars ran across his back, long ones, deep ones, proof that he had not always lived alone. He poured water into a basin once it was warm and set it on the table. "Turn around," he said. She froze. "It's just the welts," he added. "You'll lose that arm if we leave it." She turned slowly. Her dress clung to her back, stiff with dried blood. He didn't rush. He worked like a man repairing a fence after a storm. Careful. Steady. He peeled fabric away from torn skin. Some of the marks were fresh, some were not. Lines across her back, across her ribs, across her hips. A pattern. Regular. Repeated. His hand paused for a beat. "He did this?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "After my husband died," she said. "He said I owed him for the farm." Gideon dipped a cloth into warm water and cleaned each cut without speaking. She flinched at first, then less, then not at all. No man had touched her without harm in months. His hands were rough, but they were careful. Outside, the forest shifted. An owl called once. She looked at him over her shoulder. "You knew Elias," she said. He nodded. "Good man." "He wrote about you," she whispered. "Said you saved his life in winter." Gideon almost smiled. Guess he returned the favor. She turned back around slowly. "I read his journals after he died," she said. "He trusted you." Silence settled between them, not heavy this time, just real. When he finished, he wrapped clean cloth around her shoulder and tied it firm but not tight. She winced, then tested it. Better. Not healed, but better. He stepped back and leaned against the table. "Frank won't stop," he said. "No." She looked at the small window. "He said you lost your family in a fire," she said softly. Gideon didn't answer right away. The stove popped once as wood shifted inside. He bragged about it. She added, "That did it." Gideon's eyes darkened, not with anger, but with something colder. 10 years ago, a cabin had burned on the edge of the valley. They had called it an accident. Lamp knocked over. Bad luck. But he had always known better. Now he knew who. Frank. The same man who whipped her. The same man who poisoned Elias. The same man who had hung her from a tree like meat. This was no longer chance, no longer separate stories. This was one long rope tying them together. "You're sure?" he asked quietly. She nodded. "He was drunk," she said. "He likes to talk when he thinks he's won." Gideon walked to the door and opened it. Cold air rushed in. He stepped outside and looked around the clearing. Dark shapes moved in the trees, but not men. Traps. Steel jaws hidden beneath leaves. Pits covered with brush. Deadfall logs balanced just right. He had prepared this place for years, not knowing who would come, only knowing someone would. He came back inside and shut the door. "They'll find us," she said. "Yes." And then he looked at her steady. Then we stopped running. Her eyes searched his face again. This time she didn't see a monster. She saw a man who had been waiting a long time. She reached down slowly and adjusted her skirt. As she did, something cold pressed against her thigh, the small dagger she'd taken from him earlier. He noticed, did not react, just nodded once. Smart. Trust takes time. Outside, somewhere in the distance, a branch snapped. Not wind. Wait. Boots. Gideon reached for his rifle. "They're faster than I thought," he said quietly. And in the darkness, beyond the trees, a single match flared to life. The match burned like a tiny wound in the dark. It moved between the trees, slow and confident, like the man holding it already owned the night. Gideon put a hand up for Martha to stay quiet. He slid to the side window and looked out through a crack in the wood. More matches flared. 1, 2, then a whole ring of them, scattered through the pines, not close enough to rush the cabin in one breath, close enough to remind him there was nowhere to run without being seen. Martha's fingers tightened around the dagger hidden in her skirt. Gideon didn't call her out. He liked that she was ready. He just didn't want her spending that courage too early. He checked the latch on the door. He checked the back corner where the floorboards creaked. He checked the rifle rack and pulled down a second weapon, a short barrel shotgun. Old, ugly, loud, perfect for close work, outside. Boots moved in a loose circle, not rushing, not shouting. Men who'd been paid well and planned to collect. A voice drifted in, easy as a man talking across a poker table. Evening, ghost, Frank. Gideon felt his stomach go cold and calm at the same time. Frank sounded like he was smiling. You picked a bad night to play hero, Frank called. Gideon stayed silent. Silence made men nervous. Frank kept talking. I've got enough boys out here to turn that cabin into toothpicks, Frank said, and I've got enough patience to do it slow. Martha swallowed hard. Gideon leaned close to her. Stay low, he whispered. Do not stand by the window. She nodded. Then a bottle smashed against the far wall. Oil splashed. A second bottle followed. A third. The smell hit fast, sharp and heavy. Kerosene. Gideon's eyes narrowed. He had lived through fire once. He had carried that smell in his dreams for 10 years. A match flew. Flame bloomed along the cabin wall like it had been waiting there all along. Heat pushed in. Smoke curled under the roof line. Martha coughed and covered her mouth with her sleeve. Gideon grabbed a wet cloth and shoved it into her hands. Breathe through this, he said. The flames crawled up the logs, not roaring yet, but hungry. Frank wanted them choking and scared. Frank wanted them to make mistake. Boots thudded closer. A shadow moved near the side window. Someone testing the wall. Someone trying to get in before the whole place lit up. Gideon shifted his stance to block Martha. Then the window frame creaked. A face appeared for half a second, a man pushing his shoulders through. Martha moved without thinking. The dagger flashed. She drove it forward, hard. The man grunted and vanished back into the dark. Blood spattered the sill. Martha froze, shocked by what she had done. Gideon didn't scold her. He nodded once, like she had just passed a test. Good, he said, outside. The wounded man cursed. Another voice snapped at him, a voice with authority and panic, trying to stay tough. The same voice Gideon had heard in town when laws were read out loud. The deputy. So the badge really had been part of it. Martha's eyes widened. That's him, she whispered. Gideon didn't answer. He listened to the deputy's breathing, ragged and angry, as he stumbled in the dark. He stored it away. The fire grew stronger. Crackling now, the cabin filled with smoke, and the air turned hot and mean. Frank called again, louder, like he wanted the whole mountain to hear. Here's the deal, he said. You give me the widow and what she's hiding. You walk out alive, Gideon. You keep breathing, and I'll let you crawl back up into your rocks. Martha stared at Gideon. In her eyes was the old fear, and something new. Guilt. She believed the fire was her fault. She believed Frank's men were here because of her. She took a step toward the door. Gideon caught her wrist. No, he said. She shook her head. Yes, she whispered. You'll die in here. He held her gaze, and he could see the truth. If he refused, Frank would burn the cabin to the ground. Then Frank would keep hunting. Then Martha would still be trapped. One way or another, Gideon released her wrist, but he didn't let her go unarmed. He reached under the table and pulled out a small wrapped bundle. He pressed it into her palm. It felt heavy. Rough paper, a stub of fuse, it looked like a stick of blasting powder. Her eyes locked on it. What is this, she asked. A bargaining tool, Gideon said. Her throat tightened. I don't know how to use it. You don't have to, he said. Just hold it like you mean it. She looked like she might shake apart. He leaned closer. Frank believes what he sees, he told her. So show him something he can't ignore. The roof creaked as heat rose. A burning drop of resin fell from a beam and hissed on the floor. Martha gripped the bundle. Her knuckles went pale. I can't, she whispered. Yes, you can, Gideon said. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't dress it up. He just spoke like a man describing the next step on a hard trail. You've been surviving him, he said. Now you're going to face him. Outside. Frank called again. Last chance, he said. Open that door and walk her out. Gideon lifted his rifle. He moved toward the back corner where the roof line was lowest. There was a trapdoor panel he'd cut into the boards years ago, for smoke and for shooting. He pushed it open. Hot air rushed out. He climbed, slow and careful, onto the roof beams under the eaves. From there he could see the ring of men. Torches, rifles, faces half lit, half hidden. Frank stood near a stump, coat collar up, looking very pleased with himself. Gideon could see the deputy, too, clutching his side, angry and embarrassed. Gideon settled his rifle against the roof edge. He breathed once, then twice. He chose his angles. He chose his exits. Below him, inside the cabin, Martha stood at the door. She looked at the handle like it was a snake. Gideon tapped the roof lightly with his knuckles. A signal. She nodded without looking back. She opened the door. Smoke rolled out behind her like a dark curtain. She stepped into the firelight. Holding the bundle out in front of her, Frank laughed. Then he stopped laughing, because Martha raised her voice, and it didn't sound like a victim anymore. And Gideon, on the roof above, already had Frank centered in his sights. Martha stood in the doorway with smoke rolling behind her like a dark curtain. Firelight painted her face in orange and silver. Her hands trembled, but she kept them out in front, holding that wrapped bundle like it was the last word in the world. Frank took one step closer. Smiling like a man who thought he'd already won, he lifted his chin so everyone could see him. That's a good girl, he said. He reached for the bundle like it belonged to him. Martha's voice came out thin at first, then steadier. You're going to say it, she told him. You're going to say what you did to my husband and what you did to me. Frank laughed, loud enough for his men to laugh with him. You want a confession, he said. You think that little stick is going to make me honest? Martha swallowed and raised the bundle higher. I'll light it, she said. The words sounded brave, even if her eyes were terrified. Frank's smile tightened. For the first time, he looked at her hands instead of her face. He looked at the fuse. He looked at the way she held it. Not like a miner, not like a man who'd worked powder, like a widow learning to bluff with trembling fingers. He took another step. Gideon lay flat on the roof above, rifle steady on the edge. Watching Frank's shoulders, he watched Frank's eyes. He watched the deputy, too, pacing near the trees with one hand clamped to his bleeding side. The deputy's gaze kept flicking to the cabin. He wanted in. He wanted the map or the money, whatever it was. He wanted it bad enough to wear a badge and still act like a wolf. Frank held up both hands like he was making peace. Easy now, he said. You don't want to do something foolish. Martha's throat tightened. You already did, she said. That landed. Not because it was clever, because it was true. Frank's face hardened. He turned his head slightly and spoke without looking away from her. Circle wide, he muttered. Men shifted in the trees. Boots moved through brush. Gideon's eyes narrowed. They were trying to get behind her. They were trying to grab her before she could even pretend to light anything. Gideon fired. The shot cracked and a rifleman near the left flank spun and dropped. The circle broke for a heartbeat. Frank jumped back and cursed. Men raised their rifles toward the roof. Gideon was already rolling to the other side, using the heat waves and smoke as cover. Bullets punched through the cabin roof where his head had been. Splinters rained down. Martha flinched, but she stayed standing. Frank shouted, Kill him. Take her alive. That was the whole truth right there. Gideon called down from the roof, voice firm. Now, he said. Martha turned and ran back into the cabin. Frank's men surged forward, angry and eager. They were not thinking about the ground. They were not thinking about the mountain. They were thinking about the prize. A boot hit a hidden steel jaw trap. Metal snapped shut. A man screamed and fell. Another man rushed in to help him and stepped onto a covered pit. Brush gave way. He vanished with a grunt, crashing into the hole. Two more men tried to spread out, and a deadfall log dropped from the dark. It hit the ground with a hard crack and pinned one of them by the legs. Chaos rose fast. Frank shouted again, trying to sound in control. The deputy fired at the cabin window, not caring who he hit. Gideon took that personally. He popped up long enough to fire one clean shot. The deputy's hat flew off, and the man stumbled back into the trees, yelping more from fear than pain. Frank's men turned their guns back to the roof. Gideon was already gone. He slid down the backside of the cabin where the flames were thinner, boots hitting earth, knees bending like springs. He moved through smoke and heat and ducked inside through a rear gap. The cabin was a furnace now. Fire crawled up the walls and chewed the ceiling. Martha stood near the back corner, coughing into the wet cloth, eyes wide. She still held the bundle. "You did good," Gideon said. He grabbed a blanket from the bed and tossed it over her shoulders. He didn't look at her torn dress. He looked at her feet. He needed her moving. "Where are we going?" she rasped. He kicked a loose board aside behind the stove. Cold air breathed up from below. A hidden opening, a shaft. Martha stared at it. "No," she whispered. Gideon's voice stayed calm. "It's the old mine," he said. "It's the only way out. Outside." Frank's men were shouting again. They were coming closer. The front wall groaned as fire weakened the logs. Time was out. Martha backed away, shaking her head. Gideon grabbed her shoulders and held her steady. "Look at me," he said. She forced her eyes up. "You're not going back to him," Gideon said. "Not tonight." She trembled, then nodded once, like a person stepping off a cliff on purpose. He helped her down into the opening. The air below was cooler, damp, smelling of earth and old metal. She lowered herself slowly, breath fast, hands searching for footholds. Gideon followed right after, dropping with control, landing hard. Above them, the cabin crackled and roared. He pulled the board back over the opening as much as he could, then grabbed his rifle and turned. A narrow tunnel stretched into darkness. Martha pressed her back to the wall. Breathing like she was drowning, Gideon took her hand without asking. He squeezed once. "Just walk," he said. "Count your steps if you need to." They moved deeper. Behind them, the cabin groaned again. Then a loud crack split the night, and part of the roof collapsed. Dust drifted down the mine shaft in a fine rain. Martha coughed and stumbled. Gideon caught her and kept them moving. After 50 yards, the tunnel widened into a small chamber. Old rails ran along the floor. A broken ore cart sat on its side. The place felt like a mouth that had been closed for years. Martha's breathing turned sharp. She looked at the ceiling, then the walls, then the tunnel behind them. Too close, too dark. Her eyes started to glaze. Gideon saw it. "Hey," he said quietly. "Stay with me." She swallowed hard. "I can't," she whispered. "It's small. It's closing." Gideon pulled her against his chest, and firm and steady, and like he was holding her up again under that pine tree. "It's not closing," he said. "It's just quiet. Outside, muffled through earth and timber." Frank's voice carried faintly up. He was shouting orders. He was furious. He could not see where they went, and that made him dangerous. Gideon listened for the direction of the steps. He heard men moving around the cabin. Then he heard the sound he didn't want, a board shifting. Frank had found the opening. Gideon's eyes narrowed. He raised his rifle and aimed back down the tunnel toward the shaft, not to shoot a man, to shoot the support. He fired once. Wood splintered. He fired again. A beam cracked. Then the mine answered with its own voice, a low groan, a shudder through stone. Rocks began to tumble at the far end, and dust rolled in a thick wave. Martha clung to Gideon, eyes wide. The tunnel behind them collapsed in a choking roar, sealing the way they came. Silence followed, heavy and final. Gideon lowered his rifle. He had stopped Frank from coming down after them. He had also locked himself and Martha inside the mountain. He looked into the darkness ahead. Then he looked at Martha, shaking in his arms. And that was when he realized the hardest part was not the gunfire outside. It was what the dark was about to do to her next. Dust hung in the air like fog that refused to move. The tunnel behind them was gone, not cracked, not partly blocked. Gone. Rock and timber sealed it tight. Martha clung to Gideon's shirt with both hands, breathing fast, shallow, like she had run miles instead of a few steps. "It's too close," she whispered. Her voice echoed back at her, small and frightened. Gideon kept one arm around her shoulders. He didn't rush her forward. He didn't pull away. He let her feel something solid. "It's just rock," he said quietly. "Rock doesn't move unless you make it." Her fingers tightened. "You don't know that," she said. He did, but he didn't argue. He waited. He counted her breaths in his head. 1, 2, 3. slow enough that his own breathing set the pace. After a minute, her grip loosened just a little. That was enough. "We keep walking," he said, slow, no surprises. The chamber they stood in was wider than the tunnel, but not by much. Old mining rails ran crooked along the ground. A broken ore cart leaned on its side like a tired mule. Water dripped somewhere in the dark. Steady. Patient. Martha swallowed hard and nodded. He handed her a small lantern from a shelf carved into the wall. He struck a match and lit it. The flame flickered, then steadied. Soft yellow light pushed back the dark just enough to show stone and shadow. They moved forward, not fast, not careless. The air was cooler here, damp and still. After 20 steps, Martha's breathing started to quicken again. The walls felt closer, the ceiling lower. Her eyes darted left and right like something might crawl out of the stone. "Look at the light," Gideon said gently. "Just the light." She tried, but fear does not listen to reason. It listens to memory. "They locked me in a cupboard once," she said suddenly. The words tumbled out like they had been waiting for a whole day. Gideon's jaw tightened. He didn't ask who. He knew. "I thought I was going to die," she whispered. It felt like this. He stopped walking, not because he wanted to, because he knew pushing her now would break her. He turned and faced her fully. "It's not the same," he said. "You can walk here. You can move. You're not trapped in a box." She shook her head. "It feels the same." He stepped closer and pulled her into his chest again. Not romantic, not rushed. Just steady. "You feel my heart?" he asked. She nodded against him. "It's beating slow," he said. "Yours will match it." He waited again. After a while, it did. Her shoulders dropped. Her hands relaxed. She stepped back on her own this time. "All right," she said quietly. They walked deeper. Hours passed, and the darkness finally began to thin. The tunnel curved slightly, and the air changed. Not stale, not dead. Moving. Gideon felt it against his face. Faint draft. That meant another opening somewhere ahead. Hope. Small but real. They reached another chamber, this one larger. The lantern light caught something pale on the ground. Martha froze. Bones. A human skeleton slumped against the wall, boots still on its feet. An old pickaxe lay nearby. Gideon knelt beside it. No hat. No coat. Just a man who had dug too deep and never found his way out. Beside the bones sat a wooden crate, half open. Gideon lifted the lid fully. Inside were sticks of blasting powder, wrapped in wax paper, stacked neat and dry. Whoever left it had kept it off the wet ground, sealed tight, like he planned to come back. Old, but not ruined. He let out a slow breath. "Well," he muttered. "Seems the mountain left us a gift." Martha looked from the bones to the crate. "You're thinking of using that," she said. "Yes. For what?" He glanced back the way they came. "Frank won't stop at the cabin. He'll search for another way down. He'll circle to the valley. If we come out near his camp, we're going to need more than one rifle." Martha stared at the crate again. "You locked us in here," she said quietly. "I locked him out," Gideon corrected. Then he stood and walked toward the back wall. A narrow passage sloped upward, almost hidden by shadow. He lifted the lantern higher. Air flowed stronger here. Not much, but enough. He smiled. "Just a little. This mine connects somewhere," he said. Old maps showed veins running toward the valley. And Frank built his camp right on top of old ground because he thought nobody would ever come up from below. Martha stepped closer, toward the logging camp. She whispered. He looked at her. She nodded slowly. "The silver," she said. "The land Frank wanted. It all fit together now. The poisoned husband, the whipping, the trap on the mountain, not rage, not pride. Silver. Frank's hunger had a shape." Gideon returned to the crate and picked up one stick of blasting powder. He weighed it in his hand. Then he looked at the wrapped bundle he had given Martha earlier. She noticed. "That wasn't real," she said softly. He almost smiled again. "No." Her lips parted, half offended, half impressed. "You let me bluff with a fake," she said. "You did fine," he replied. For the first time since the pine tree, She gave a small, tired laugh. It echoed gently in the chamber. Then her eyes moved to the skeleton again. What if this passage collapses too? She asked. It won't, he said. You can tell by the beams. He pointed to the old timber support, still strong, still holding. He paused. Unless someone weakened them, unless someone wanted to bring a whole structure down. He looked at the blasting powder again, then at Martha, then toward the faint draft at the end of the passage. A plan was beginning to form. Not escape, not just survival, something sharper. They could leave quietly, slip out near the valley and keep running. Or they could come out exactly where Frank felt safest, or where he believed he controlled the ground. Martha saw the look in his eyes. You're not thinking about hiding, she said. No. She swallowed. Then what are you thinking? He handed her the lantern. Frank built his empire on stolen land, he said, and he believes this mountain belongs to him. Gideon picked up the crate of blasting powder and slung it over his shoulder. Well, he added calmly, it's time the mountain answered back. And as they stepped into the narrow passage that led toward the valley below, neither of them knew they were walking straight toward the one place Frank would never expect them to appear. The passage sloped upward for nearly half a mile before the air changed again. Not damp, not stale. It smelled like sap and fresh-cut timber. Gideon slowed and lifted a hand. Martha stopped behind him, lantern shaking just a little. Ahead. Faint light slipped through cracks in rough planks. Voices drifted down. Men laughing. Axes striking wood. The steady grind of a saw blade biting into pine. They had come out exactly where Gideon hoped. Under Frank's logging camp. He leaned close to the boards and peered through a gap. Morning light washed over stacked lumber, wagons, and a long shed where men worked stripped to their shirts. Frank's camp was alive, busy, confident. No one expected ghosts from beneath their own ground. Gideon stepped back. He set the crate of blasting powder down quietly. Martha swallowed. This is it, she said. Yes. She looked pale but steady. He liked that. He pointed toward a side tunnel branching left. That leads under the main shed, he said. I saw the layout years ago when they first dug here. She nodded slowly. You've been planning this. I've been waiting, he corrected. They moved through the side tunnel, lantern low, above them. Boots thudded on wooden floors. Voices carried through the boards, one voice louder than the rest. Frank. He was barking orders about shipments and accounts like nothing had gone wrong the night before. Martha stopped walking. That's him, she whispered. Her hands clenched, not shaking now, clenched. Gideon set 2 sticks of blasting powder against a central support beam in the tunnel. He worked fast and simple, no complicated lines, just enough to shake the ground hard and loud. Not to kill workers, to break control. He lit a short fuse and looked at Martha. Back, he said. They moved 20 yards down the tunnel and waited. The fuse hissed in the dark. Then the earth answered. A deep thud rolled through the ground. Boards above cracked. Dust rained down. Men shouted. Another blast followed as the second stick ignited. Above them, the long shed shuddered and part of the floor gave way. Screams erupted. Not death screams. Shock. Panic. Gideon grabbed the lantern and climbed through a split in the planks where daylight streamed in. He pulled Martha up after him. They emerged into chaos. Workers scrambled away from the broken section of floor. Axes dropped. Wagons tipped. Frank stood near the main office building, face red with fury. What happened? He roared. Gideon stepped into full view. Rifle in hand. Calm. Frank's eyes widened for the first time since this began. You, he said. Me, Gideon answered. Men reached for rifles, but something shifted, not from Gideon, from the workers. A thin man with sawdust in his beard stepped forward. You've been skimming our pay, he shouted at Frank. And every worker there knew exactly what that meant. Because their kids had been eaten thin for months. Another man raised an axe. You said the shipments were light because of weather. A third voice joined in. You lied. Martha stepped beside Gideon. Her voice carried clear. He poisoned my husband for this land, she said. He whipped me to keep me quiet. Silence fell for half a breath. Then murmurs spread like fire in dry grass. Frank turned in a circle, trying to hold command. Don't listen to her, he snapped. She's hysterical. But no one was looking at Martha like she was weak anymore. They were looking at Frank. Gideon moved first when a hired gun near the wagon raised his rifle. He closed the distance fast and slammed the man down with the butt of his gun. Another rushed him. Gideon dropped the rifle and met him chest to chest. Fists flew. Heavy, clean, no wasted motion. The second man went down hard, breath knocked out. Martha didn't hide. She moved toward the office door. Frank saw her and lunged. He grabbed her arm. Hard. You don't walk away from me, he hissed. Before he could drag her back, a shot rang out. Not from Gideon. From one of Frank's own guards, the big man with the scar across his cheek. He lowered his pistol slowly. I didn't sign up to die for your greed, he said. He tossed his gun into the dirt. The workers watched. The balance shifted. Frank shoved Martha aside and ran for his office. Gideon followed. They burst through the door, seconds apart. Frank reached for the safe behind his desk. He yanked it open. Empty shelves. He spun around, confused. You think I keep everything in one place? He said bitterly. Gideon's eyes dropped to Frank's coat, heavy, stiff, too stiff for summer. He stepped forward and grabbed the front of it. Frank struggled, but Gideon tore the seam open with one hard pull. Paper spilled out and fluttered to the floor. Deed, contracts, the farm title. Martha stepped inside and picked up the paper with her name on it. Her hands didn't shake this time. Outside, the workers crowded near the door. They saw the documents. They saw the truth. Frank looked around, finally understanding. His men were not with him anymore. His workers were not afraid anymore. He shoved past Gideon and bolted out the back door. By the time Gideon stepped outside, Frank was already on a horse, kicking hard toward the open valley, toward the river cliffs. Martha stood beside Gideon, holding the torn coat in one hand and her deed in the other. Is he done? She asked. Gideon watched the dust trail fading toward the Bitterroot River. No, he said quietly. He's running, and a desperate man on a fast horse is the most dangerous thing left in the valley. Frank rode like a man who could outrun his own sins. Dust kicked up behind his horse as he tore across the open valley, heading straight for the cliffs above the Bitterroot River. Gideon didn't waste time. He grabbed the nearest horse from the camp, swung into the saddle in one smooth motion, and dug his heels in. The animal lunged forward. Behind him, Martha shouted something, but the wind swallowed it. She didn't stay behind. He heard another horse behind him moments later. She was coming too. The valley opened wide, grass bending in long waves under the morning sun. Frank had a head start, maybe 200 yards. Not enough. Frank's horse was already blowing hard, flanks starting to lather. That kind of speed never lasts. Gideon leaned low over the saddle, letting the horse stretch out. He didn't fire. Not yet. Too far. Too much risk of hitting the animal instead of the rider. Frank glanced back once, saw Gideon gaining. He pushed his horse harder. Ahead. The land sloped upward toward the river cliffs, bad ground, loose stone, sharp turns. A place where speed became danger. Frank knew it. That was why he was heading there. If he could force Gideon into a bad fall, the river would finish what he started. They climbed the slope fast. Hooves slipped on gravel. Frank reached the ridge first and wheeled his horse toward a narrow trail that cut along the edge of the cliff. Below, the Bitterroot River roared, swollen with summer melt. One wrong step meant a long fall into fast water and broken rock. Gideon slowed just enough to keep control. He followed. The trail narrowed, 10 feet wide at best, then 6, then barely enough for one horse. Frank pulled his rifle from the saddle scabbard and fired backward without aiming. The shot cracked past Gideon's shoulder. He didn't return fire. Too close, too tight. One bullet in the wrong place and both men would go over. Instead, he urged his horse forward in a sudden burst, closed the distance. Frank saw it and made his choice. He reined hard to the side and leapt from his horse onto a flat stretch of rock near the cliff edge. His horse bolted past, riderless. Gideon did the same seconds later. Boots hit stone, rifle dropped. This would not be settled at range. Frank drew a knife, long blade, bright in the sun. You should have stayed in your woods, Frank said, breathing hard. You always think that. Gideon replied. Frank lunged first, fast, desperate. Gideon stepped aside and caught his wrist, but Frank twisted free and slashed. The blade cut across Gideon's side, shallow but sharp. Pain flared, warmth spread under his shirt. Frank smiled at the sight of blood. They circled, boots scraping against rock, river roaring below. Frank charged again. This time Gideon met him head on. They crashed together, fists and elbows and knees. No clean moves now, just weight and force. Frank fought dirty. He always had. He drove his thumb toward Gideon's eye. Gideon jerked back and slammed his forehead into Frank's nose. Bone cracked. Frank staggered but didn't fall. He swung the knife again. The blade bit into Gideon's shoulder, this time deeper. Gideon grunted but didn't step back. He grabbed Frank's coat with both hands and shoved. Frank stumbled toward the edge. Loose gravel slid under his boots. For a moment, both men froze, inches from the drop. Frank swung the knife wildly and caught Gideon in the ribs. That one hurt. Gideon's grip weakened. Frank shoved hard. Gideon fell backward onto one knee, right at the cliff edge. The river roared louder now. Frank stood over him, chest heaving, knife raised. You lose everything again, Frank said, just like before. Gideon tried to rise, but blood and pain slowed him. Frank stepped closer, boot pressing against Gideon's chest. One more push and gravity would do the rest. Then a third horse thundered up the trail. Frank glanced over his shoulder. Martha. She pulled the reins hard and jumped down before the horse even stopped. Her hands were unsteady as she grabbed the rifle from the saddle. She had never liked guns, never trusted them. The sound alone had made her flinch for months. Now she lifted it. Not steady, but determined. Frank laughed. You won't, he said. Gideon looked at her. Not begging, not ordering, just trusting. Frank shifted his weight to shove Gideon over the edge. Martha pulled the trigger. The shot cracked across the cliff face. The bullet struck Frank in the shoulder. His knife flew from his hand that he staggered sideways. Stunned, his boot slipped on loose stone. The gravel gave way like it was waiting for him. For one long second, he windmilled, trying to regain balance. He failed. Frank tumbled backward over the edge. His scream was short. The river swallowed the rest. Silence returned, broken only by rushing water below. Martha stood frozen, rifle still raised. Gideon pushed himself up slowly. Pain burned through his side and shoulder. But he stayed on his feet. They both walked to the edge. Frank's body struck rock once on the way down, then vanished into white water. The current carried him fast and hard downstream. Gone. Martha lowered the rifle. Her hands began to shake now that it was over. I didn't mean to kill him, she said. You didn't, Gideon answered. They stood there for a moment, wind lifting their hair, river roaring below, sun climbing higher over the valley. Then something caught on a scrub tree just below the cliff. A dark shape snagged on a branch. Frank's coat. Torn open. Still heavy with papers inside. Martha saw it too. Her eyes widened. The deed, she said. Gideon nodded slowly. The river had taken Frank, but it had not taken everything. And down there, clinging to a stubborn little tree above the rushing water, was the one piece of paper that could decide what kind of life they would live next. Gideon moved first. Careful steps down the rocky slope. One hand gripping stone, the other steady despite the blood soaking into his shirt. Martha followed slower, but she didn't hesitate. When Gideon reached the coat, he pulled it free from the branch and climbed back up. The papers were still inside, wet at the edges, intact at the center. Martha took the deed in both hands. For a long moment, she just looked at her name, her real name. Not widow, not property, not debt. Her name. The wind moved through the grass around them. The valley looked different now. Quieter. Like something heavy had finally been set down. They rode back toward town at a slow pace, not because they were afraid, because neither of them needed to run anymore. At the sheriff's office, the truth came out, simple and clean. The workers spoke. The deputy's corruption surfaced. Martha handed over the map, too. Not for silver, but so Frank's whole chain of crimes could be dug into and proven. Frank's body was found miles downstream 2 days later. Tangled in driftwood, the law, slow as it often was, finally did what it should have done months ago. Martha stood outside the courthouse steps with the deed in her hands. Gideon stood a few feet away, already half turned toward the mountains. He had always belonged to open sky and pine trees, not fences and paperwork. At the valley, the silver beneath the valley. The silver beneath the soil. The farm. The house. Everything she had fought to keep, and everything that had nearly killed her. Inside, the clerk copied the deed into the county record book. Ink on paper. Official and final. Only then did Martha step outside and tear Frank's copy in half. The sound was small, but it carried. She tore it again and again. Pieces of paper drifted down at her boots. She sold the land to the county within the week. Cheap, quick, clean. The silver would belong to the town. The farm would pass to hands that had not been stained by greed. And when Gideon saddled his horse to head back toward the mountains, she was already mounted beside him. He reached into his pocket and pulled out something small, a ring carved from mountain cedar while they had waited in the dark of that mine. Rough, simple, honest. He held it out without speeches, without kneeling, without drama. She smiled through tears and slipped it onto her finger. They turned their horses toward the high ground together. Now let me step out of the dust of 1885 for just a moment and speak to you directly. When I think about Gideon, I don't see a perfect man. I see a man who made mistakes, a man who lost everything once and could have chosen to shut his heart forever. But he didn't. And when I think about Martha, I don't see a victim. I see someone who was hurt, humiliated, trapped, and still found the strength to stand in firelight and face the man who tried to own her life. I've lived long enough to know this. Most battles in life aren't fought with rifles on cliffs. They're fought in quiet rooms, in hard conversations, in decisions where no one is watching. You may not be standing on the edge of a river with someone's boot on your chest, but maybe you're standing at the edge of a decision right now. If you were in Gideon's boots, would you walk away to stay safe? Or would you step into danger to protect what's right? If you were in Martha's place, would you cling to land and silver, or would you choose peace and a clean start? And here's one more. What in your life needs to be torn in half so you can finally breathe? Sometimes it's a woman lifting a rifle with shaking hands. Sometimes it's a man deciding not to run this time. Hit the like button so more folks who need a little reminder about grit and grace can find this story too. Subscribe if you want to ride along on more trails like this one. And before you go, tell me in the comment, where are you listening from? What time is it where you are? And what in your life are you ready to face instead of run from? Because out there somewhere, just beyond the fear, there's a version of you waiting to stand up the way Martha did. And maybe tonight is the night you choose not to walk away.